"You just took the wrong seat." The voice came low and steady, but it carried in a way that made the quiet room feel suddenly smaller. The sound of wood scraping against polished floorboards cut through the soft murmur of conversation, sharp and out of place in a room built for ceremony and order, and for a brief second, every head turned without quite meaning to as the chair slid violently away from the old man's grasp. Arthur Bennett didn't stumble, not quite, but the motion shifted his balance enough to draw attention, his hand lingering in the empty air where the backrest had been only a heartbeat before, and the young officer holding the chair didn't even bother to hide the smirk that followed. "That seat's reserved," Lieutenant Ethan Cole said, his tone polished but hollow, the kind of authority that sounded rehearsed, not earned, and he turned his shoulders slightly, already dismissing the man in front of him as if the matter were settled. Around them, the officers' lounge held its breath in a way that no one would ever admit later, the soft clink of glassware fading, the low hum of conversation collapsing into a thin, uncomfortable silence that stretched just a second too long before people began to look away, each pretending not to have seen what had just happened. The room itself was immaculate, a careful balance of tradition and modern precision, flags standing motionless along the far wall, their colors sharp under the overhead lights, framed photographs of past commands lining the perimeter like silent witnesses, and in the center, clusters of pressed uniforms gathered in quiet conversation, their posture straight, their insignia catching the light with every subtle movement. It was the kind of place where everything had its order, where every seat meant something, where presence itself was a statement, and in that order, Arthur Bennett didn't seem to belong. His suit was clean but worn, the fabric soft at the edges, the kind of wear that came from years rather than neglect, his shoes polished but marked by time, and his posture, though slightly stooped, carried a stillness that didn't quite match the rest of him, a quiet gravity that didn't demand attention but refused to be ignored once noticed. He didn't reach for the chair again. He didn't argue. He simply lowered his hand, fingers curling slowly as if closing around something unseen, and for a moment, his eyes moved, not to the young officer who had taken the seat, not to the cluster of onlookers pretending to focus elsewhere, but across the room, steady and distant, as if measuring something far beyond the present moment. Ethan Cole let out a short breath through his nose, the faintest hint of a laugh escaping as he turned back to his peers, already slipping into the easy rhythm of conversation, the incident dismissed as quickly as it had begun. "Can you believe this turnout?" he said, gesturing vaguely with one hand, his voice rising just enough to reclaim the space he had disrupted, and a couple of the younger officers nodded, their expressions eager, their postures subtly aligning with his, reinforcing the invisible hierarchy that governed the room. No one offered the chair back. No one questioned the decision. The system had already corrected itself, or at least, that's what it looked like from the outside. Arthur remained where he was, standing just off the edge of the gathering, neither inside nor fully excluded, a quiet figure in a room that thrived on recognition, and if anyone noticed that he hadn't moved to leave, they chose not to acknowledge it. The air carried a faint scent of polished wood and pressed fabric, the distant hum of an air conditioning unit blending with the soft shuffle of footsteps, and somewhere near the far end of the room, a door remained closed, its presence unnoticed, its silence absolute. Time stretched in subtle increments, each second layering tension that no one named, and though conversation resumed, it carried a different weight now, words slightly sharper, laughter a fraction too loud, as if everyone felt the imbalance but refused to look directly at it. Arthur's gaze drifted once more, this time settling on the empty space where the chair had been, and there was no frustration in his expression, no visible irritation, only that same quiet stillness, deeper now, heavier, as if the moment had touched something long, buried and left it undisturbed. Across the room, a captain, Daniel Brooks, paused mid-sentence, his attention pulled by something he couldn't quite explain, his eyes lingering on the old man just a fraction longer than necessary, and though he quickly looked away, the unease didn't follow. It stayed, subtle but persistent, like a thought that refused to settle, and in that stillness, before anything else could shift, before anyone could understand what had already begun to change, the closed door at the far end of the room remained exactly where it was, silent, waiting. The room tried to return to normal, but it never quite made it all the way back. The conversations restarting in fragments that did not fully connect, laughter that rose a little too quickly and faded just as fast, as if everyone was performing a version of ease they did not feel. And through it all, Arthur Bennett remained exactly where he was, unmoved, his presence no longer invisible but not yet acknowledged. A quiet disruption that refused to settle into the background. He shifted his weight slightly, the subtle movement of someone used to standing longer than most, his hands resting loosely at his sides, not clenched, not tense, simply still, and there was something about that stillness that made it difficult to look at him for too long, as if it asked a question no one in the room was prepared to answer. Ethan Cole had already taken his seat, leaning back just enough to signal ownership, one arm draped casually over the backrest, his posture relaxed in the way of someone who believed the moment had confirmed his place rather than challenged it. And he continued speaking to the officers around him, his voice carrying just enough confidence to anchor the group, though beneath it, there was a faint edge now, something sharper, less controlled, as if he felt the need to reinforce what had already been done. "We have a full schedule tonight," he said, glancing briefly toward the far end of the room, toward the closed door that remained untouched. "So let us keep things moving." The words were ordinary, but the way he said them carried an unspoken claim, a quiet assertion of authority that hung in the air longer than it should have. No one questioned it. A few nodded. One or two murmured agreement. The system held. But across the room, Daniel Brooks did not nod. He had turned slightly, his body still angled toward the group he had been speaking with, but his attention no longer belonged there. His eyes drawn again to the old man standing alone, and this time he did not look away immediately. There was something about the way Arthur stood that did not fit, not in the sense of dress or age or place, but in something deeper, something harder to name, a kind of composure that did not bend under pressure, that did not react the way it was expected to. And Daniel felt it before he understood it, a quiet certainty that what he was seeing did not match what it appeared to be. He had seen men under stress before, seen how posture changed, how eyes shifted, how small signs gave away discomfort or uncertainty, but none of those signs were there, not even a trace, and that absence was louder than any reaction could have been. Arthur's gaze moved again, not quickly, not searching, just steady, passing over the room with the calm of someone who had stood in places far less controlled than this. And for a brief moment, his eyes met Daniel's. It was not a challenge. It was not even acknowledgement. It was simply a glance, but it carried weight, the kind that lingered after it passed, and Daniel felt it settle somewhere deep, a quiet unease that sharpened into something closer to recognition, though he could not yet say of what. He looked away first, the motion almost involuntary, and when he did, his breath caught just slightly, as if he had been holding it without realizing. Around them, the room continued its careful performance, glasses lifted, voices measured, uniforms immaculate, but the balance had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not yet, not quietly. Near the far wall, a young officer adjusted his collar, his fingers lingering longer than necessary. Another checked his watch, though nothing had changed. Small movements, subtle, but they echoed the same underlying tension, the same awareness that something had happened that did not belong in a room like this. Arthur remained still. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He simply stood, and in that standing, there was a kind of refusal, not loud, not defiant, but absolute, a quiet line drawn without a word. Ethan laughed again at something someone said, the sound sharper this time, and for a brief second, his eyes flicked toward Arthur, just a glance, quick and dismissive, but not entirely unthinking, and then he looked away, returning to the conversation as if nothing remained unresolved. But something did remain. It lingered in the space between people, in the pauses between words, in the way attention kept drifting back despite every effort to ignore it. And at the far end of the room, the closed door that no one had touched seemed suddenly more significant than before, its silence no longer neutral, but expectant, as if it marked a boundary that had not yet been crossed but soon would be. The tension did not break, it thickened, settling into the room like a weight that pressed down on every conversation, every movement, every glance that lingered a fraction too long before being pulled away, and Ethan Cole felt it even as he continued to speak, though he would never have admitted it, his words coming a little faster now, his tone just slightly sharper as he leaned forward in his chair, reclaiming space that had never truly been challenged until a few moments ago. "Look," he said, his voice cutting across the nearby group, not loud enough to command the entire room, but strong enough to draw attention again. "There is a reason we have order here. There is a reason seats are assigned, and not everyone just walks in and decides where they belong." The statement was not directed at anyone by name, but the intention was clear, and a few of the younger officers shifted, some nodding, others forcing small smiles that did not quite reach their eyes, their agreement more reflex than conviction. Arthur Bennett did not respond. He did not move closer, did not step away, did not even turn his head toward the voice that had once again tried to define the boundaries of the room. He simply stood, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged, and that lack of reaction did more than any argument could have done, because it left Ethan speaking into something that did not push back, something that did not acknowledge his authority at all. That silence stretched, subtle but unmistakable, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something behind Ethan's expression, not doubt, not yet, but irritation, the kind that came when control did not produce the expected result. He let out a short breath, adjusting his posture, one hand tapping lightly against the arm of the chair as if to remind himself of where he was, of what he represented, and then he leaned back again, forcing a casualness that did not fully settle. "If you are here for the event," he added, this time looking directly at Arthur, his eyes narrowing just slightly, "you should probably check in properly. There is a process for that." A few heads turned again, drawn by the directness of the statement, and the room held its breath once more, waiting for something, anything, that would resolve the imbalance. Arthur's eyes met his, calm, unhurried, and for a moment, the noise of the room seemed to recede, the low hum of conversation fading into something distant and indistinct. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," Arthur said, his voice quiet, almost conversational, but it carried in a way that did not need volume, the words settling into the space between them with a weight that was difficult to ignore. There was no challenge in his tone, no attempt to assert dominance, just a statement delivered with the certainty of someone who did not need to prove it. A brief pause followed, longer than it should have been, and then someone near Ethan let out a small, uncertain laugh, trying to break the moment, to restore the balance that had slipped again, but the sound fell flat, echoing awkwardly before disappearing altogether. Ethan's jaw tightened, the movement subtle but visible, and he shifted in his seat, his confidence now edged with something harder, something less controlled. "Right?" he said, a hint of sarcasm creeping into the word. "And I suppose you were personally invited." The remark drew a few more forced smiles, a couple of quiet chuckles that felt more like obligation than humor, and for a second, it seemed as though the room might settle back into its previous rhythm. But Arthur did not look away. "Yes," he said simply, the word landing with the same quiet certainty. And that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just a single answer that refused to expand into something easier to dismiss. Across the room, Daniel Brooks felt the unease sharpen, his mind moving now, connecting fragments that had not yet fully formed into understanding. The posture, the voice, the absence of reaction, all of it building towards something that did not align with the assumptions everyone else seemed comfortable making. He glanced toward the far door again, then back to Arthur, then to Ethan, the pieces shifting, not yet in place, but moving closer, and a decision began to take shape, not fully conscious, not yet acted upon, but present, pressing forward with quiet insistence. The room remained suspended, balanced on a moment that refused to resolve, and somewhere in that stillness, beneath the surface of controlled voices and measured movements, something deeper had begun to turn, slow but certain, like a tide that no one in the room could see yet, but would soon be impossible to ignore. The words settled into the room and did not move, and for a moment no one seemed willing to disturb them, as if speaking too quickly might reveal something they were not ready to see. And Ethan Cole felt that pause more than anyone, the silence pressing against him in a way that forced a reaction he had not planned, his confidence now tightening into something more deliberate as he leaned forward again, his fingers tapping once against the table before stopping entirely. "That is not how this works," he said, slower this time. Each word measured, controlled, as if precision alone could restore the balance that had slipped, and he gestured lightly toward the seating arrangement, toward the order that defined the room. Invitations are logged, verified, and assigned. This is not an open floor. A few heads nodded again, more cautiously now, as if agreement required more thought than before, and the officers nearest him shifted in their seats, their posture no longer fully relaxed, their attention divided between the conversation and the man who had not moved since the chair had been taken from him. Arthur Bennett remained still, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his gaze now, not defensive, not reactive, just focused, as if he were considering something beyond the words being spoken, something that did not need to be explained to anyone in the room. He took a single step forward, not toward Ethan, not toward the group, but toward the empty space where the chair had been, his movement slow, deliberate, and the soft sound of his shoe against the polished floor carried farther than it should have, drawing attention without asking for it. The chair itself sat slightly off-center now, angled where it had been pulled away, its legs casting thin shadows under the overhead lights, and Arthur reached out, not to take it back, not to claim it, but simply to steady it, his hand resting briefly on the worn wood of the backrest. The contact was light, almost absent, but the moment his fingers touched the surface, something in his expression shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else would immediately notice, but internally, as if the present had opened a narrow door to something far older, something carried quietly for decades without ever needing to be shown. The room did not see what he saw, but Daniel Brooks felt the change without understanding it, his attention sharpening again, his instincts pulling him closer to a realization that remained just out of reach. Arthur's hand lingered for a fraction longer than necessary, and in that brief contact, the polished floor, the pressed uniforms, the measured voices of the room seemed to fall away, replaced by something else entirely, something distant and weathered, the faint echo of rotor blades cutting through humid air, the steady vibration of metal under strain, the memory of a seat that had never been about comfort, but about survival, about position, about who held it and who did not, and for a moment, the simple act of touching the chair carried a weight no one else could see. He released it just as quietly as he had taken hold of it, his hand returning to his side, his posture unchanged, but the stillness that followed was deeper now, more grounded, as if whatever memory had surfaced had settled back into place, leaving behind only its quiet certainty. Ethan watched the movement, his eyes narrowing slightly, not because he understood it, but because he did not, and uncertainty had no place in the structure he relied on. "If you are finished," he said, the edge in his voice more visible now, "you should step aside. We are about to begin." The words were firmer, less conversational, an attempt to close the moment, to push it back into something manageable, and for a second, it seemed as though the room might accept that, might allow the narrative to return to its original path. But Arthur did not step aside. He did not move at all. He simply looked at Ethan, his gaze steady, calm, and something in that look made the space between them feel narrower than it was, as if distance had become irrelevant. "I am not in the way," Arthur said quietly, the words simple, almost understated, but they carried the same quiet certainty as before, and once again, they did not expand into anything easier to dismiss. Around them, the room shifted again, not visibly, not dramatically, but in small ways that added up, a hand pausing mid-gesture, a conversation trailing off before it reached its point, a glance held just long enough to acknowledge what everyone was beginning to feel. Daniel Brooks turned fully now, his attention no longer divided, his focus locked on the man standing near the displaced chair, and in that moment, the pieces aligned just enough for something to take hold, not a full understanding, not yet, but a recognition that the situation was no longer what it appeared to be. His hand moved almost instinctively toward his pocket, where his phone rested, and though he had not yet acted, the decision was forming, solidifying beneath the surface, waiting only for the final push. At the far end of the room, the closed door remained silent, but its presence felt different now, no longer distant, no longer neutral, but connected to the moment in a way that was becoming harder to ignore, as if everything in the room, every word, every movement, every pause, was leading toward it, toward whatever waited on the other side, and the longer it stayed closed, the more certain it became that when it finally opened, nothing in the room would remain the same. The silence after his words did not fade. It deepened, settling into the room with a weight that pressed against every uniform, every polished surface, every carefully maintained line of order, and Ethan Cole felt it closing in around him, subtle but undeniable, his authority no longer expanding outward but meeting resistance in a way he could not quite define. And that uncertainty sharpened his tone as he leaned forward once more, his fingers tightening briefly against the arm of the chair. Before releasing, "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said, his voice controlled but no longer casual, the edge now visible beneath the surface, and he rose from his seat in one smooth motion, the legs of the chair scraping lightly against the floor as he stepped forward, closing the distance by a few feet, not aggressively, but with intention. Around them, conversations faded again, not abruptly, but in layers, voices lowering, then stopping, as attention shifted back to the center of the room where the imbalance had refused to resolve. Arthur Bennett did not step back. He did not adjust his stance. He simply stood, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, and there was something in that stillness that made Ethan's movement feel louder than it was, more deliberate, more exposed. "This area is restricted to invited personnel," Ethan continued, each word placed carefully, as if clarity alone could restore control. "And if your name is not on the list, then you need to step aside so the event can proceed." The statement hung in the air, formal now, no longer a suggestion, and a few of the officers nearby shifted their weight, their posture tightening as if preparing for resolution, whatever form it might take. Arthur's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his breathing, a slow, measured inhale that seemed to anchor him more firmly in place, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet certainty as before, unchanged by the escalation around him. "The list does not always know who belongs," he said, the words simple, almost reflective, but they landed with a weight that disrupted the clean lines of authority Ethan was trying to reestablish. A faint murmur rippled through the room, quickly suppressed, but not before it registered, and Ethan's jaw tightened again, the reaction immediate, instinctive. He took another step forward, now close enough that the space between them felt intentional, defined not by distance but by presence, and for a brief moment, he hesitated, not visibly, not in a way anyone else would easily recognize, but enough that the pause existed, however small. "We are not going to debate policy," he said, the words firmer now, less controlled, the edge breaking through. "Either you comply, or I will have you escorted out." The phrase carried weight, not because of what it implied, but because of how it was delivered, the room recognizing the shift from conversation to enforcement, and the officers nearest the exchange straightened slightly, their attention sharpened, waiting. Arthur did not respond immediately. His gaze moved once, briefly, not toward Ethan, but toward the chair again, the same chair that had been taken from him, now slightly askew, its position unchanged since he had steadied it moments before. His eyes rested there for a second longer than necessary, and though no one else could see what passed through his mind, Daniel Brooks felt it again. That same quiet shift, that same sense that the present moment was connected to something far older, something that carried weight beyond the room they stood in. Arthur's hand moved once more, not reaching this time, just hovering briefly at his side, fingers flexing slightly, as if remembering a motion long practiced, long understood, and then stilling again. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, but it carried farther, cutting through the tension with a clarity that did not rely on volume. "I have stood in places where seats did not matter," he said, each word measured, grounded. "And I have stood beside men who understood that." The room did not react immediately, the meaning of the words settling in slowly, not fully understood but felt, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the space itself had shifted beneath them. Ethan's expression hardened, the lack of direct compliance pushing him further into the role he had chosen, and he turned his head slightly toward the nearest staff officer, a subtle signal, unspoken but clear, the next step already forming. Across the room, Daniel Brooks made his decision. His hand slipped into his pocket, fingers closing around his phone, and without drawing attention, he stepped back half a pace, angling his body just enough to shield the movement from the immediate circle. His heart rate had picked up, not from fear, but from the quiet certainty that whatever was unfolding did not belong to the chain of command currently standing in the room, and that certainty pushed him forward. He moved toward the side corridor, each step measured, controlled, his expression neutral, but his mind already racing ahead, pulling together fragments, names, possibilities, until one connection surfaced, faint but undeniable. He did not hesitate. As he reached the edge of the room, he turned slightly, ensuring no one was watching, and brought the phone to his ear, his voice low, urgent, but steady. "This is Captain Brooks," he said, keeping his tone even despite the tension behind it. "I need to confirm a guest. Arthur Bennett. I believe there has been a mistake." The line on the other end remained silent for a fraction of a second, and in that silence, something shifted again, something deeper, something that moved beyond the room itself, beyond the immediate conflict, and back inside, where Ethan stood facing the man who refused to move. The balance continued to tilt, slow but certain, toward a point that no one present could yet fully see, but all of them would soon feel. The call did not last long, but it did not need to, and on the other end of the line, silence was not confusion. It was recognition, the kind that arrived instantly and carried weight with it, and Daniel Brooks felt it the moment the voice returned, lower now, more focused, stripped of casual tone. "Repeat that name," the voice said, and Daniel did, clearly, without hesitation, "Arthur Bennett." And this time there was no pause at all, only a sharp intake of breath that came through the line before the response followed, controlled but urgent. "Where are you right now, Captain?" Daniel gave the location, precise, and the answer came immediately after, no delay, no uncertainty. "Stay where you are. Do not let him leave." The line went dead without another word, and Daniel stood there for half a second longer, the phone still at his ear, the weight of that instruction settling in, heavier than anything that had been said inside the room so far. When he lowered the phone, his expression had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough that if anyone had been watching closely, they would have seen it, the shift from uncertainty to something far more defined, something that carried quiet urgency beneath a controlled exterior. He turned back toward the room, his steps measured, but faster than before, his mind already moving ahead, replaying the exchange, the name, the tone of the voice on the other end, the absence of doubt, and it all pointed to one conclusion he had not fully allowed himself to consider until now. Inside, nothing had resolved. Ethan Cole still stood facing Arthur Bennett, the distance between them unchanged, but the air felt tighter, more compressed, as if the room itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something it could not yet see. The officers nearby had stopped pretending to ignore the situation, their attention now openly fixed on the two men at the center, their posture straight, their expressions controlled, but their focus unmistakable. Ethan's patience had worn thin, though he masked it behind formality, his voice steady but edged when he spoke again. "This is your final warning," he said, each word deliberate, leaving no room for interpretation. "You will step aside, or you will be removed from this area." The phrase carried authority, reinforced by the structure of the room, by the uniforms, by the expectation that orders, once given, would be followed, and for a moment, it seemed as though everything rested on what would happen next. Arthur did not respond immediately. He did not shift his stance, did not glance toward the door, did not acknowledge the escalation in any visible way. He simply stood, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged, and that stillness now carried something more than calm, something deeper, something anchored far beyond the immediate moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but it carried with absolute clarity, cutting through the tension without effort. "You are standing where you believe you should be," he said, his tone even, reflective, "and I am standing where I know I should be." The distinction settled into the room, subtle but undeniable, and for a brief second, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the meaning had landed in a place that could not be easily dismissed. Ethan's expression tightened, the words striking somewhere deeper than he expected, and he turned slightly, his attention shifting toward one of the staff officers positioned along the wall, his intent clear without needing to be spoken aloud. The staff officer straightened, ready to act, his posture snapping into place as if responding to an unspoken command, and the moment stretched, balanced on the edge of action. At that exact point, Daniel Brooks stepped back into the room. His return was quiet, almost unnoticed at first, but his presence carried something different now, something that altered the current of the moment in a way no one could immediately define. He moved with purpose, not rushing, not drawing attention, but each step placed with certainty as he approached the edge of the gathering. His eyes moved directly to Arthur, then to Ethan, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was no hesitation in his gaze. He stopped just short of the central space, his voice low but firm when he spoke, directed not at the room, but at Ethan. "Lieutenant," he said, the single word enough to draw attention again, enough to pause the motion that had been about to unfold, and there was something in his tone that did not match the earlier uncertainty, something that carried weight without raising volume. Ethan turned toward him, irritation flashing briefly before being contained, his posture shifting as he acknowledged the interruption. "Captain," he replied, controlled but tight, "we are handling a situation." Daniel held his gaze for a moment, steady, unyielding, and then he spoke again, each word measured, deliberate. "I know exactly what this is," he said, and the room seemed to contract around the statement, the implication not yet clear, but unmistakably present, and in that moment, the balance shifted again, more sharply this time, as if something long delayed had finally begun to move into place. Daniel's words did not echo, they settled, heavy and deliberate, and for a moment the room seemed to contract around them, every line of posture, every measured breath tightening as attention shifted fully toward him, toward the certainty in his tone that did not match the uncertainty that had filled the space only seconds before. Ethan Cole turned more fully now, his stance adjusting, not retreating but recalibrating, his authority meeting something it did not immediately recognize, and that unfamiliar ground forced a pause he had not intended to give. "Then explain it," Ethan said, his voice controlled but edged, the demand clear, though it carried less weight than before, as if the structure behind it had begun to shift. Daniel did not respond immediately. He took one step forward, just enough to enter the center of the room without claiming it, his gaze moving briefly to Arthur Bennett, then back to Ethan, and when he spoke, his voice remained low, but there was no hesitation in it now, no uncertainty left to soften the edges. "You are not looking at a misplaced guest," he said, each word placed carefully. "You are looking at someone who does not need to check in." A faint ripple moved through the room, subtle but unmistakable, the implication landing before the meaning fully formed, and several of the officers shifted, their attention sharpening, their posture tightening in a way that no longer aligned with Ethan alone. Ethan's expression hardened slightly, the challenge now more defined, and he crossed his arms, not defensively, but to anchor himself in the role he understood. "Everyone needs to check in," he replied, the words firm. But there was a fraction of hesitation now, a crack small enough to miss unless someone was looking for it. Daniel held his gaze, steady, unyielding, and for a brief moment, neither man spoke, the silence stretching again, but this time it carried direction, movement beneath it, something building toward a point that was no longer abstract. "I made a call," Daniel said finally, his tone unchanged, but the weight behind it clear, and the moment his name was spoken, the line did not question it. It did not ask for verification. It did not ask who he was. It asked where he was. The words settled deeper than anything before them, and the room responded, not with sound, but with stillness, a collective recognition that something far beyond the current chain of command had just entered the equation. Ethan did not speak right away. His jaw tightened, his posture shifting again, the certainty he had relied on now meeting something larger, something that did not fit within the boundaries he had set. "That does not change protocol," he said after a moment. But the words lacked the same force, the same clean authority they had carried before, and even as he spoke them, it was clear they were no longer enough. Daniel did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it, and then he turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the far end of the room, toward the closed door that had remained untouched since the beginning of the confrontation. "No," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself, though everyone heard it. "It does not change protocol." A brief pause followed, just long enough for the meaning to settle, and then he added, "It changes who defines it." The room did not move, but something inside it shifted, subtle but irreversible, and several officers glanced toward the door now, not because they had been told to, but because something in Daniel's words had directed their attention there without command. Arthur Bennett remained still, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, but there was something different in the way he stood now, not more assertive, not more visible, but more grounded, as if the space around him had begun to align with him rather than resist him. Ethan followed the direction of the room's attention, his eyes flicking briefly toward the door before returning to Daniel. And for the first time, there was a question there, not spoken, but present, and it altered the way he held himself, the way he occupied the space. "What exactly are you implying, Captain?" he asked, the words controlled, but the certainty behind them no longer absolute. Daniel did not answer immediately. He listened instead, not to the room, not to the people within it, but to something else, something faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the ambient noise of the building, but growing clearer with each passing second, the subtle shift in rhythm that signaled movement beyond the walls, beyond the immediate scene. Then it came, quiet but unmistakable, the sound of a door opening somewhere down the corridor, not the one in front of them, but close enough that the change in air carried into the room, subtle but real, and every head turned just slightly, instinctively, drawn by a cue no one had given. Daniel's gaze fixed on the door now, his posture straightening, not in tension, but in readiness, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm, certain, final. "I am not implying anything," he said. And then, after the briefest pause, he added, "I am telling you that whatever you think is about to happen next, it is not." The words did not linger, they anchored, and in the silence that followed, the closed door at the far end of the room seemed no longer like a boundary, but a threshold, and everyone in the room, whether they understood it or not, was already waiting for it to open. The sound did not rush in. It arrived with precision, the firm, measured cadence of footsteps moving down the corridor beyond the door, each one distinct, evenly spaced, carrying a weight that did not need volume to command attention. And the room responded before anyone consciously chose to. Conversations cutting off mid-word, shoulders straightening, eyes shifting toward the source as if drawn by something older than protocol, something instinctive. Ethan Cole felt it too, the shift that did not belong to him, the kind that did not ask permission. And for the first time since the confrontation began, he did not speak, his posture adjusting almost unconsciously, his stance tightening as his attention moved fully to the door at the far end of the room. Daniel Brooks remained still, his gaze fixed, his expression calm but alert, the certainty he carried now matched by what approached from the other side. And beside them, Arthur Bennett did not turn immediately, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if he had been expecting this moment long before anyone else recognized it. The handle moved with a quiet, deliberate motion, not rushed, not hesitant, and the door opened inward with a soft, controlled sweep that revealed the corridor beyond, the light from outside shifting slightly as the figure stepped through. General Richard Hayes did not enter quickly. He stepped into the room with measured precision, his uniform immaculate, every line sharp, every detail exact. But it was not the uniform that commanded the space. It was the presence, the kind that settled instantly, altering the room without a word. He did not look around. He did not acknowledge the gathering, the officers, the arrangement of rank and position that had defined the space only moments before. His gaze moved once, direct and unbroken, and it landed on Arthur Bennett. The effect was immediate. The room stilled in a way it had not before, not tense, not uncertain, but absolute, as if every motion had been paused at once, and even those who did not understand why felt it, the shift from controlled tension to something far more final. Ethan stood where he was, his posture rigid now, no longer relaxed, no longer anchored in the confidence he had held before, and though he did not move, something in his stance changed, the realization beginning to surface, not fully formed, but undeniable. General Hayes took a single step forward, then another, his pace unhurried, his attention never leaving Arthur, and as he closed the distance, the space between them seemed to disappear, not physically, but in the way it was perceived, as if everything else in the room had become secondary, background to a moment that had already taken precedence. He stopped just in front of Arthur Bennett, close enough that there was no question of who he had come for, and for a brief second, there was silence, complete and unbroken, the kind that carried weight without needing sound. Then, without announcement, without hesitation, General Hayes straightened fully and brought his hand up in a crisp, unmistakable salute. The motion was precise, practiced, but there was something more in it, something that went beyond formality, beyond obligation, and it held for a moment that felt longer than it was, the room absorbing it, processing it, understanding it piece by piece as it unfolded. No one spoke. No one moved. The officers who had been seated rose almost in unison, not by command, not by instruction, but by instinct, their posture snapping into place as the significance of what they were witnessing settled in. Ethan's reaction came a fraction later, his body responding before his mind fully caught up, his stance shifting, his shoulders tightening, the structure he had relied on now aligning with something far greater than his own authority. Arthur Bennett did not immediately return the salute. He looked at Hayes, his expression unchanged, but there was something in his eyes now, something that carried history, recognition, and a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. Then, slowly, with the same measured control he had carried throughout, he raised his hand and returned it, the motion steady, deliberate, and when it was done, he lowered it just as calmly, as if the moment had already said everything it needed to say. General Hayes dropped his salute, but his posture remained firm, his gaze still fixed on Arthur, and when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but it carried through the room with absolute clarity. "You should have been given your seat," he said, not loudly, not angrily, but with a certainty that left no room for interpretation, and the words settled into the room like a final correction, precise and undeniable. No one responded. No one needed to. The shift had already happened, fully now, completely, and the room that had once defined itself by order had just been redefined by something far older, far deeper, and impossible to ignore. No one moved after the words were spoken, not because they had been ordered to remain still, but because movement no longer felt appropriate, the room settling into a silence that carried more weight than any command ever could, and in that silence, every detail seemed sharper, clearer, as if the moment had stripped everything down to what truly mattered. General Richard Hayes stood facing Arthur Bennett, his posture still precise, but no longer formal in the rigid sense, something in it softened by recognition, by memory, by a respect that had nothing to do with rank alone, and Arthur met his gaze without hesitation, the quiet understanding between them filling the space where words might have been expected. Around them, the officers remained standing, their posture aligned, their attention fixed, not out of obligation now, but out of something deeper, something that had shifted within each of them the moment the salute had been returned. Ethan Cole stood among them, but no longer at the center, his earlier confidence replaced by a stillness that mirrored the room itself, his expression controlled, but the realization behind it unmistakable, the structure he had relied on now fully redefined by a reality he had not seen coming. His eyes moved once, briefly, toward the chair that had started it all, its position unchanged, slightly out of place, a small detail that now carried far more meaning than it had before, and for a moment, he hesitated, the decision forming slowly, deliberately, before he stepped forward. The sound of his shoes against the floor was quieter this time, measured, and he reached the chair without drawing attention to himself, his movements careful, precise, as if aware that anything less would break the balance that had settled over the room. He adjusted it gently, aligning it back into its proper place, the legs set evenly, the angle corrected, and then he stepped back, his gaze lifting toward Arthur, not with defiance, not with authority, but with something closer to acknowledgement, a silent recognition of what he had failed to see before. He did not speak. He did not need to. The action itself carried enough weight, and when he returned to his position, his posture remained straight, but it no longer sought to define the room, only to exist within it. General Hayes watched the movement, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, a quiet approval that did not need to be stated. And then he turned slightly, his attention still anchored to Arthur as he gestured, not with command, but with invitation, a small motion toward the restored seat. Arthur looked at it for a moment, his gaze steady, not hurried, as if considering something beyond the surface of the gesture, and then he stepped forward, his movements as measured as they had been from the beginning, each step placed with quiet certainty. He reached the chair, his hand resting briefly on the backrest once more. The same simple contact, but now it carried a different meaning, no longer tied to displacement, but to restoration, and he lowered himself into the seat with calm, unhurried control, his posture settling naturally, as if he had never been out of place at all. The room remained silent, but it was no longer tense, no longer uncertain, the weight of the moment shifting into something steadier, something grounded, and one by one, the officers allowed their posture to ease, not fully relaxed, but no longer rigid, their understanding of the room now aligned with what had been revealed. Daniel Brooks exhaled quietly, the tension he had carried since the beginning finally releasing. Though he did not move, his attention still fixed on Arthur, on the presence that had changed everything without ever raising its voice. Ethan remained still, his gaze forward, but there was something different in the way he held himself now, something more measured, more aware, as if the lesson had settled deeper than the moment itself. And though he said nothing, the silence around him carried its own acknowledgement. General Hayes remained standing for a second longer, his eyes on Arthur, and then he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before turning to face the room, his presence once again encompassing the space. But now it felt different, not as an authority that needed to be asserted, but as one that had already been understood. No announcement followed. No correction was spoken aloud. None was needed. The room had already adjusted, already realigned, and in the quiet that followed, the only thing that remained was the unspoken truth that had revealed itself in full, that respect was never taken by force, never granted by assumption, but recognized in moments like this, when silence said more than any words ever could, and in that silence, the lesson remained, steady and undeniable, long after the moment itself had passed.